Okay. Today, my guest is Professor Tarun Khanna. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Tarun as a person, and Professor Khanna is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally, as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Tarun was nominated Young Global Leader Under 40 by the World Economic Forum, is a fellow of the AIB, and received the Eminent Scholar Award for Lifetime Achievement in International Management by the Academy of Management. In addition to his vast research activities, since 2010, Tarun has been involved in many interesting initiatives in developing countries and emerging markets. For instance, he has developed and delivered multidisciplinary project-based university-wide courses, as well as an online edX platform course that reached over more than 500,000 students in 200 countries. More recently, he served on several national commissions in India to further advance Indian universities' education policies, enhance entrepreneurship education, broaden the scientific curricula. So thank you, Tarun, for your time. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, August. Thank you for having me. It's very kind of you.
First question, always, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Oh, that's easy. I mean, I think most young boys want to do something with sports. And so growing up in India, I wanted to play cricket until I discovered I wasn't good enough. But one thing that I did intend to do quite seriously was to join the Air Force. And of course, this would be the Indian Air Force because I grew up in India. And I even began to move down that road until I discovered that my eyesight would not let me get past. And so fortunately, I discovered that early enough that I could, I guess, change directions. As you know, in many developing countries, you make these decisions about careers very early on.
Yeah.
And so, but those were my first two aspirations, so to speak. I had no intention of being an academic ever. So.
I mean, in developing markets, emerging markets, by high school, you're pretty much set for life.
Yeah. No.
So can you pinpoint the earliest moment of awareness between domestic versus international?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Your first distinction, first awareness of domestic versus international when you were a child.
Oh, I see. So in India, you couldn't, if you were in the better off classes, upper middle class or the elite classes, you couldn't avoid but being aware that there was an international environment and a domestic environment because it was a very controlled economy in the 70s and 60s, 70s, and 80s when I was growing up. And particularly in the early years, lots of Western items which you were aware of since it was there in the public media and the press were inaccessible, even to fairly well-off people in the country. So the awareness was always there. There is something about the outside. And to me, anyway, it was always, I love to travel. I still do, which is why the last 9 months under COVID has been very difficult for me. And why my work has embraced going around the world and traveling and meeting people and understanding how people live. So that fascination was, as far as I can remember, was always there. And perhaps heightened because in India, you couldn't access it so easily in the protected time. So I would say probably as early as 5 or 6 years old, I would guess. And my father worked for Unilever. And so he would travel around the world and send me letters and postcards from different places. So I suppose that must have had some kind of formative influence also.
When did you choose to be, or how did you choose to be an IB scholar?
I think that was actually very late in the game because even in my PhD, I had no interest in doing IB per se. My self-identity is as an applied mathematician. Primarily, I'm fond of abstract ideas. I'm fond of parsimony. I'm fond of putting structure in complicated things. And to me, I sort of meandered into what we call IB, quite happily, I must add, but it was not by any conscious decision. I think for me, the dominant thing was my PhD was at Harvard in a program called Business Economics, which required you to do 1 year of the MBA program, which in retrospect was the best training for me, even better than the PhD courses, because I had to come face to face with very practical people, very hard charging Harvard MBAs who were immersed in practical problems. And I should also say that my mother's side of my family were quite successful business people in India. And so I grew up also surrounded by, interestingly, a combination of business speak. And then my mother is a philosopher of Sanskrit and Indian philosophy. So we had both the academic side and the very practical, how do you build a successful business side? You know, I never saw the distinction between them. They were just, you know, fields of human endeavor, and you did what you did. You just did it as best as you could. And so I remember sitting in the MBA classroom at Harvard and saying, you know, a lot of what these guys are talking about, the logic sounds right, but the logic, if applied in a developing country context, would often yield the opposite conclusion from what they are concluding in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or New York City. And that's because the context is so different in which that logic is being applied. And so I remember always raising my hand and saying, this makes no sense. Where I come from, this would not work. And of course, there was never any issue with the logic. It was always with the application of the logic and the presumption that what was working in Boston and New York would work in Mumbai and Jakarta and Sao Paulo, or Istanbul, as the case might be. And that set me on this quest of understanding differences in creative activities, creative commercial activities, and entrepreneurship in different developing countries. So I suppose that's how I meandered into it. And then I used my tools as a social scientist, applied math person, to try to make some progress in it.
If you stop doing what you're doing today as an academic, what would you be doing? What is the second best alternative career path for you?
Oh, that's easy. I'm already doing it as my second career in parallel. I love the creative process of, and I'll say this more abstractly than say it in a practical way also. The abstract thing that I like to do is I love mixing ideas and playing with them, right? So a really interesting example last week with some colleagues was getting scientists together with artists. And the scientists were, people who have PhDs in things like material science and organic chemistry, but they work as heads of conservation in very famous museums. And their job is to maintain human heritage, paintings, sculpture, and you need just an enormous amount of science to preserve 1,000-year-old artifacts, to prevent degradation, environmental destruction, the sanctity of the color scheme, different kinds of spectroscopy to imagine what was going on. So the point I'm trying to make is that I really enjoy mixing and matching the science and the art. And in a practical sense, what I found is that that has led me to many insights is too pretentious, but not insights, but ideas about new nonprofits and new businesses to start, but always in the developing world. My only interest is in working with the masses who are economically and socially excluded. So I say 6 billion of the roughly 8 billion people in the world is my small domain of inquiry. But it's true, most of what we do, even including IB, is targeted to the 1 to 2 billion of people who are, to whom we can relate. I'm more interested in the 6 billion that we can't relate to intellectually. We don't have the conceptual apparatus, or we haven't spent enough time, I think, understanding that. And I think that the future of the human race is very tied up, the future of 6 of our 8 billion brethren. So I'm constantly starting organizations that that help me immerse myself in a problem of the poor in a developing country, in whatever form it takes. And that's what I would do if I had to leave at the academy. That's what I would do full time.
What are you most passionate about?
Oh, my children. I mean, I think it's just completely fascinating to see them grow and be independent human beings. I like to think, I hope, my wife and I have tried very hard to make them good human beings primarily, and tried to be not with much success, I must say, be hands off in terms of letting them do what they want. They always say, "You're interfering, mom, dad, you're interfering." So, and they're probably right about that. But really to watch them become very different people from each other. My daughter is 20 and my son is 18. And one of the things we love to do, my wife and I love to do, is travel with them, because I love travel, seeing different places. And right from the time my daughter was 6 months old, I remember we took her to Cairo and to some other places in that part of the world. And it was a disaster for us because we had to handle a little baby in the middle of nowhere. But it's just second nature to us to be with the kids and to travel. So we're going through a very difficult transition in our home, and both the kids are off to college, and we have to rediscover our interests in some ways. But that would be my primary passion.
Have the kids decided what they want to become?
Sort of. My daughter is a bit more sure. She is very interested in, two and a half very different things, or three different things. The primary thing is to be in medicine in some way. She likes biology and chemistry and things like that, and to be in medicine. And then, but also married very much with a real kind of, I guess it comes with youth, moral indignation about the injustices of the world. And so she's very much into racial injustice and what to do about it, and social injustices and so on. So she's very much in the front lines of that movement and trying to marry medicine with that. So you see her major in school is to be, in college is to be pre-med, but also to study sociology. And then again, because of our travels, my kids both speak many languages. And so she's very interested in Asian civilization. So she's obviously Indian, but also Chinese, speaks fluent Mandarin and fluent Hindi and things like that. And my son is younger, so he's discovering himself. He's interested in politics and governance and local city politics and governance. And again, with this sense of I have to do something to make my city a better place, and this is my responsibility. But he couldn't care less about math and science. He's more, do politics and history. So that's what I mean. It's very different people. So it's great. It's wonderful.
Very interesting. Okay, let's talk about your research. So how do you explain your research to people who don't read your material, like to laymen? For example, you get stranded in a pub. There are locals around you. They don't really have too much of an attention span, and you're an item of curiosity for people. How do you explain what you do to them?
Oh, that's easy, because I'm frequently in different pubs explaining what I'm doing in different parts of the world, or cafes. I'm interested in how creative people can engage in creative problem solving in the developing countries. I really do think that at the abstract level, the process of creative problem solving is similar, because we're all human beings. We all basically think the same way. We use pattern recognition. We have a mixture of emotion and feeling and what we sometimes loosely call rationality to inform our decisions. So at that very abstract level, we're all the same. But on the Monday morning, when the rubber hits the road, the reality of how you translate that into a viable organization to bring it closer to business schools and international business and so on is really quite different. When property rights aren't enforced, when risk capital is scarce, when regulatory or government action is sometimes unpredictable, how do you actually practically form solutions to this? And most of all, which is the title of the last book that I wrote called Trust. The book was called Trust, Creating the Foundation for Entrepreneurship in Developing Countries. that was more a self-reflection exercise where I asked myself in the last 20 years, if I had to pinpoint one thing that I think characterized all successful entrepreneurs that I've met in developing countries, is there a single thing that would, as we say in the empirical social sciences, absorb a lot of the variance in the dependent variable? And I think my answer would be that the would-be entrepreneur has to cultivate a sense of trust amidst an ocean of mistrust. So if I think about my own upbringing, trust was very easy to come by in relatively circumscribed circles. People in your family, your kinship network, your immediate environment where you lived, where you had multiple engagements with people day in and day out. But to trust an arm's length outsider would be a Herculean task, and you have to invest a lot of energy in overcoming that mistrust. And that, of course, is sand in the wheels of commerce and creativity, and it prevents things from happening. The simplest example that I always use in the developing world is, we're all in the world where Amazon packages show up at our doorstep. Even today, in most parts of the world, you wouldn't just let the package show up and do nothing. You would make sure somebody got it and moved it to a safe place. Whereas in our house in Newton, Massachusetts, the doors are open all day. I mean, the garage door is wide open. The front door is sometimes open. The backyard is open. People are leaving packages. They're sitting there for days on end. There is a sense in which somehow people will not necessarily do the wrong thing. Now, I'm cognizant that there are parts of the US where that doesn't happen. And of course, there are difficult places. But by and large, I think it's fair to say that in the places where I spend my professional time, mistrust is a good descriptor of the environment within which creativity has to ensue. And I think it's a very difficult problem. So that's kind of my the description of what I try to work on. Yeah.
I'm curious about something. The more we teach transaction cost, the more we teach about lack of trust, mistrust, or the varying degrees of lack of trust. Do you think people are mistrusting more now that we're teaching it explicitly?
Oh, so this is a line of question that you often hear social scientists ask economists, right? Do you think people have become more calculating because they studied economics? And I believe, though I'm not fully sure, that there is some evidence, maybe in a laboratory setting, that that's true. That people who study economics, are more prone to calculate everything because that's the way that they've been taught. Ilgaz, I don't know. I don't think so. On your question, I think it's the whole scholarship that Coase and then Ollie Williamson and others and a whole bunch of people in their wake enlightened us about is fabulous. And I think it's a really amazing organizing principle of why things get done the way that they do. And in some sense, my own limited contribution is in that line, is to elaborate that in the developing country context and to try to think about ways to make it practical. Because the idea of a transaction cost is not immediately practical to a financier or an entrepreneur or a business person. So what I've been trying to do in the applied part of my work is to translate that into a taxonomy of things that a business person could look out of his or her window on Monday morning in Johannesburg, or in Santiago, and say, "Oh yeah, with this taxonomy, I can say which kind of transaction cost is more likely to be a problem for me, and come up with a plan to either treat it as an entrepreneurial opportunity to do something about that." And I refer to this in my work as institutional voids. So there's certain institutions that are missing that you'd like for them to be there, but if they're not there, then either you adopt the mindset that you, in your planning, you do something about it, you factor that into your plan. You don't just assume that, you don't assume that phantom factor exists, because then you make a misstep, which was what was happening in my MBA classroom when I was a student. People were assuming that they could do A, B, and C when really the foundations of that assumption were not there. Or you treat the institutional void as an entrepreneurial opportunity. You fill the void. And as Douglas North's seminal work, historian Douglas North's seminal work showed us, filling of transaction costs is maybe, or elimination of transaction costs is perhaps the dominant, or at least a dominant source of economic progress, right? It's a gradual building up of institutions that allow other people to do other things. I think that the work that I've done on using the taxonomy of institutional voids to organize, dozens, maybe hundreds of projects and papers. As I said, as an applied math person, I always retreat to parsimonious models. The simpler, the better. And what I like about the institutional void framework is that it's so simple. It's just a list of things, mutually exclusive and almost collectively exhaustive in some ways. Let's say these are the various sources of transaction costs. And it has its limitations like any parsimonious framework, but it gets me started.
Very clear. Tarun, what do you see as the future? What's the next 5 to 10 years of IB research? What are the omitted variables, the forgotten variables, things that will pick up in the next decade?
It's a good question. So I gave an invited address at the Academy of Management last time around, of course, in this virtual world. And I think it was, I forget the title, but it was something about new computational techniques for international business research. And the reason I mentioned that is that, we're on the cusp of some really amazing, not just the cusp, we're there. The tools and techniques exist for social scientists of all sorts, and IB scholars included, to embrace various forms of quantitative techniques that are all ultimately driven by just raw computing power. And what I mean by that is you can apply so-called natural language processing models to things that people say, right? So think about all the qualitative work that people have been doing for decades. Very interesting, very descriptive, very beautiful, very insightful qualitative work. Still continues to be hugely important, but on top of that, what you can do is you can run these natural language processing models on top of it and extract additional insights or extract additional descriptors of reams and reams and reams of paper that might suggest different ways of looking at the information that are embodied in that wouldn't automatically occur to you. And then, as a scholar, you're free to say, I don't like it or I like it. Or here's why I think this makes sense or not. But at least it suggests different things. So that's an example. In a paper that I wrote with some scholars at Columbia and Harvard in the, where was it? I think in the Strategic Management Journal, we tried to show that some fairly common problems that business school researchers try to do, you can use these new computational techniques that come out of machine learning and basic artificial intelligence algorithms and natural language processing to extract all sorts of new dependent variables and independent variables. So it's the explosion of data and the explosion of cheap computing power and the increasing sophistication of pattern recognition and so on. You can do things with emotions on people's visual expressions. So we have some wonderful video archive, publicly available video archive that I've been creating with a historian at Harvard for 5 years of iconic entrepreneurs who have shaped the international business environment around the world. And these are people who are like the Rockefellers of their countries. But in the West, we don't pay attention to them because they're not front and center. And they don't normally speak in public, but because we come from a reputable institution, we've been able to persuade them to speak on the record for public consumption. And those are now freely available on our websites for teaching and research. But you can take that video archive and you can actually analyze the tone of the person's voice. When he or she is remembering an episode in their history, you can see their facial expressions and categorize emotions. Now, I'm not suggesting that this should replace our human intuition about inflection of voice and tone of voice or expression on the face, or should replace any qualitative insights that we have. Simply that these are complementary ways of generating, in response to your question, dependent and independent variables for us to be considering. So my short answer would be the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see an explosion of this in IB research.
Interesting. I mean, it reminds me of Colin Camerer's work at Caltech. He was looking at the emotional responses he was connecting these things on the brain. It does remind how, for the sake of time, last question in the research segment, which research area, which research question or the type of question is overly done in IB that it should not be pursued by new students or junior faculty?
Which question should not be pursued? Oh, I think you should not do what I did when I first finished my PhD, which is I basically raced through my PhD because I was in a rush to get out. I was doing basically applied math in the economics department and very little to do with IB. And then I arrived at my first job. This was my office when I started. I'm still in the same office, 27 years later. And I basically looked at the literature and I said, what's the next thing to solve in this literature, right? And I started writing these incremental papers. And I had kind of figured out how to get them published quite easily. So, and after about a year, I said, goodness, what a waste of time. What a complete colossal waste of time. So that is what I would not do. I would not pick an existing line of research and try to tweak it and incrementally add to it. That is the seduction that we all have, because there's so much pressure in our system to publish quickly and to publish with the gatekeepers and to get into the certain journals. And that's a guaranteed way to make no impact, right? So if your desire is to impact, and I hope most people have that desire, at least early in their careers, I think you should be guided by the phenomena. I mean, you should think of something that really excites you. Like in my case, I gave you my story. It was just this incredible irritation and bemusement in the MBA classroom and saying that, if I think about our family businesses in India, none of this stuff that they're teaching at HBS makes any sense to me. It's not going to work. I know it. I've been on the factory floor. It's not going to work. So it's not going to work. And that motivated my research, right? So not saying that that's the only way, but it's a way to try something different.
Now that we're talking about advice and mentoring, what are the big, before I ask you what are the big mistakes that commonly you see that people do, I'm really curious. How do you tell people how to sell their ideas? How do you sell new ideas that are groundbreaking, that are very new? How did you sell your idea about new things that are unexpected, that are not on the books, that's not in the literature? You're going to run into editor problem. The referees are going to be giving you pushback. How do you sell that new idea?
It's both an important question. Of course, as a scholar, you will not have impact unless you can sell your ideas, either through the process of writing and persuasion or presentations or some combination thereof. I recognize that. I mean, I don't know that I have anything novel to say about this. I think passion sells. If you're really excited about something, and I think I really believe it really translates into something that you do better, and that enthusiasm shows. And I know I've run, recruiting for different parts of Harvard for on and off over the last decades, and clearly everybody responds to someone who is very, very excited about his or her work. And you can see that even if at that moment you don't agree with this radical idea that the scholar is presenting, that enthusiasm plus some evidence of general intellectual training and horsepower the odds are higher that it'll translate into something compared to someone who is relatively unenthusiastic. So that's the first observation. And I think in our line of work, you know, we really are about scholarship for practically impacting, in this case, international business, right? And so I think it really pays to be immersed in the phenomenon with people who are experiencing whatever that is that you're interested in. And there's really a two-way learning that occurs, which is why I really, I enjoy starting my own ventures and nonprofits and companies as much as I enjoy writing papers, because to me, they're just a part of the immersion process in some ways. And the last thing I'll say then, that one of the colleagues when I was a doctoral student and then junior faculty member, somebody a few years ahead of me chronologically said, it always helps to have some puzzle, that you pose explicitly or implicitly to your audience, and then really it's the resolution of the puzzle that the puzzle hooks people in, and then the resolution draws them into you. So you look for a puzzle.
Tarun, what was the best advice you ever received?
Goodness. Best practical advice in our in this current conversation space, I would probably say it was from I can think of two instances. I'll share both. One was from the person who hired me here. It was Mike Porter, who of course is a famous economist in strategy. And Mike was running our strategy unit at HBS at Harvard Business School, and he's the one who hired me. And I remember our classroom is, I don't know if you've ever seen it, guys. It's an amphitheater-shaped classroom, HBS, and everything is a very intense discussion. So I remember he took me, and our strategy course always started in January. It's very dark, it's winter, and so Mike, early January, before the course started, before the first time I taught, which was in January of 1994, he walked with me. He said, walk with me to the classroom. The classroom was a building called Aldrich, which is where we still teach some of our classes. And we walked into an empty classroom. There was nobody there. It must have been it's pitch dark outside. It must be 6 p.m. And he took me to the classroom and he said, what do you see? And of course, I didn't see anything. I saw an empty classroom with chairs. So I looked at him puzzled and he said, you should look around and you see people in these chairs, right? Just remember, never talk down to anyone, right? Because every one of these people is more accomplished than you in something. And I just remember thinking, here's this so profoundly accomplished man, who, is from it's his voluntary advice in some ways and delivered in a very matter-of-fact way. It said, whatever you do, as long as you don't talk down to people and you treat them like you're equals, and you realize that somebody in our classroom is an Olympic athlete, someone has served in the Marine Corps in some theater of war, someone has built big chains of pizza chains. Don't fall into the trap of saying, wow, you have a fancy set of degrees from multiple Ivy League institutions and therefore you're somehow smarter than them. There's no evidence that you're smarter than them. It's just that they have excelled in a different line of human endeavor than have you. If you were in their shoes, you'd probably screw it up. And so and that humility, I think, is so important. And that stayed with me. 27 years later, it's popping into my head as a really important thing. And the second thing was from my dissertation advisor, one of my dissertation advisors, Kim Clark, who later on became the dean of Harvard Business School. At the time, he was a professor in the technology operations management unit. And I went to Kim and I said, I don't want to study what you're studying. I want to study these other things. So you're my advisor. And he looked at me and he said, "What do you need?" I said, I need some money. So I need this other thing. So I remember him saying, here's a lot of rope, go hang yourself. In other words, in a very nice way. Kim was very nice to me. He was an amazing, amazing mentor, and really, really, between him and Mike Porter and a bunch of other people, they really carried me through my years as an assistant professor, and such eminent people. But what Kim was basically saying to me was, I'm going to treat you the way I expect you to treat your students and others, which is once you trust them, once you think they have some basic capability, give them a lot of rope, right? Give them a lot of rope, give them whatever they need, and then hold them accountable, right, for their actions. That's all. And in a sense, it wasn't advice, it was the way he was acting towards me. But it modeled how I think I like to act towards people. I tell them, okay, you're responsible, go do it. Don't come to me all the time because I don't have the answers, and probably I'm too busy anyway. And you're smarter than me in many ways. So knock yourself out, go do it. And then be willing to stand up and be called to account for your actions. And then the same thing should apply to me. So I think those two vignettes or episodes stick in my mind, Gus.
Very humbling. These are very humbling things to hear. Last question for the sake of time. What is one question that I should have asked you but didn't so far?
Why are you doing what you're doing?
Here you go.
I hope it doesn't sound too corny or cliched, but I guess my kids and my wife also, but my kids more explicitly, their sense of moral outrage probably comes from me and my wife, right? Which is that there is so much, you look at people look at the COVID world, how many people are kind of suffering through it. And you basically look at these people and you say, there, but for the grace of God go I, right? That could have happened to me. I mean, your life can change in an instant, so many different ways. So, I'm trying to do something for the 6 out of 8 billion people who are disenfranchised, usually through no fault of their own, right? Almost entirely through no fault of their own. And that's what all my scholarship is about. That's what all these different government commissions, volunteer work, enterprises, everything is about. I'm currently really, really excited about a new charity that I started with my colleague, Karim Lakhani. It's called Crossroads. And it's a charity program for first in family to college kids, disadvantaged kids, primarily in the developing world, but now we're going to be everywhere in the world. In 3 years, we've gone from identifying what we call lost Einsteins, people who are very, very talented, but just don't have the ability to be discovered. And I think it's a moral outrage. It's a moral outrage. And so Karim and I created this, sitting here in this office 3 years ago exactly, and said, let's run some amazing competitions around the world right here and see if we can encourage people to apply. And if they apply and they turn out to be really very talented in some way, the way we started, we said we will fly them for 1 week to Dubai, our expense. So we flew with some help from airlines and charities and so on. We flew 50, 60 people in the first year from 8 countries to Dubai and showed them, for 1 week, we showed them the time of their life. Right? So these are people who are coming from a small village in Burma, from war-torn Central Africa. They never left anywhere, but you test them with math skills, talking, imagination, interviews, all virtual, alumni interviews from Harvard, and you realize they're smarter than all Harvard kids. They just grew up in the Congo. They don't have a chance. So we found these kids and we brought them, and that word spread like fire. So after 3 iterations, we're in 97 countries now, right?
Wow.
On a shoestring budget, right? Nothing. And I want to say we've changed the lives of a few thousand kids who were just very smart and very disadvantaged. So next year, Kareem and I are going to spend a lot of time into making this an independent nonprofit and then just dedicating time to it. So this is why I do what I do. And it's very related to my research on, if you ask me to draw a direct line from that story that I just told you of 97 countries, first in family to college kids, I can point to at least 3 scholarly papers, including some very mathematically complex papers that are saying the same thing, right? But why do we do what we do? It's a question we should all ask ourselves. I think it anchors us.
Thank you, Tarun. This was fascinating. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ilgaz. It's very nice of you to do this. And I wish you well, your family and you, and lots of safety and good cheer in the holidays.
Thank you.